One of the coolest new features of ASP.NET MVC 5.0 is attribute routing. In version 5.0, built-in support for attribute routing is added. In version 5.1, support is added to have route constraints for your attribute routing. In version 5.2, extensibility is added to attribute routing through the iDirectRoute provider interface. Essentially, attribute routing allows routes to be defined with attributes on controller classes and their action methods. In earlier versions of MVC, routes were configured with the route config class in the static method register routes. But in the latest version of MVC, you can also define these routes through these new attributes. There are actually 3 new attributes which are available in attribute routing. One is the route attribute, which is applied to a controller action, which actually defines the specific route for that controller action. The next is the route prefix attribute, which defines the prefix for all of the routes on a particular controller. This attribute actually gets applied to the controller class itself. And then finally, there is a route area attribute, which defines the area for a collection of routes, and it too is also applied to the controller class. So next we're going to do an attribute routing demo, and we're going to take a look at the many different ways we can configure routes with attributes. For this demo, we're going to take a look at attribute routing. In order to complete this demo, we actually need a new MVC 5 project. So we're going to go to New, Project. We're going to select the ASP.NET Web Application Project. We'll stick with the default name. Click OK. We'll come up here and make sure we click our MVC template, make sure that our core references and folders for MVC is checked. We're going to change the authentication to no authentication. We're not going to require any unit tests for this demo, and we're not going to deploy this demo to the cloud. So we'll click OK. Visual Studio has created our solution. We will rebuild it just to make sure that everything was set up correctly, and it was. It succeeded. And we will run this to make sure that it loads up properly. And it has loaded up properly, so our solution is properly set up. So let's take a look at attribute routing. To understand the context of attribute routing within the MVC routing system, it's good to take a look at the routing config file. Traditionally, routing in MVC applications has been done in this register routes function. And in this register routes function, there's a number of functions that you can call. One, in this case, is routes.ignoreRoute, and this will actually ignore any routes that look like this. And then we have routes.mapRoute. And here you can add in all the various routes that you want to set up for your application. And this is the way that it's been done since the inception of MVC. But now there's a new way to do routing. It's called attribute routing. And to make use of it, we actually have to come in here and we first have to turn it on. By default, it's turned off. And by turning it on, we do this. We call map MVC attribute routes. And so with that command in the register routes function, we can now make use of attribute routes in our application. So what exactly are attribute routes? Let's go down here to our home controller. And let's take a look at what we have. We actually have 3 actions. We have an index, about, and a contact. And so if we go to run this application, the home page loads up. If we actually type in /home/about, and we come down here and put a breakpoint on about, and we type enter, it's going to take us back to Visual Studio, and you're going to see where our breakpoint has been hit inside of this about action. And we'll continue, and we'll see the web page gets loaded. With attribute routing, we actually have the ability to override the routes that are configured using the map_route function in the route config class. I can leave that breakpoint there, but I'm going to come up here and add a new attribute. As soon as I stop running the project, I'm going to add a new attribute called route. And inside of it, I can actually specify a new route for this particular action. This new route is going to be called About Us. So now I can run this application. And then come up to the URL, and if I type in About Us, you'll notice it now hits the About action. Now there's a couple of things I want to point out here. Number one, you'll notice in our URL, I don't specify, let me finish running it here. I don't specify a controller name. All I do is specify About Us. When setting up a route attribute, by default, when you specify what the route path is going to be, it does not automatically include the controller name. So instead of home/about, it's now just About Us. But I want to show you one other very interesting feature about this. If I go to run this, and I type in my old route, because remember, the new route is About Us, but if I type in the old route, home about, watch what happens. It's not found. When using attribute routing, you can't combine attribute routing with the traditional routing system. You have a choice. You can use one or the other for a particular controller action. So in this case, because I have this route set to About Us, I can't make use of the home/about anymore. If I were to remove this and run it again, once again, I can type in home/about, and I go back to my About action. Now the next thing that I can do with this is I can actually specify some route constraints within my route attribute. So I'm going to come back here and type in my route again. We're going to call it About Us. But this time, I just want to pass in an ID value. Okay? Now right now, I'm going to let this ID value be anything that I want it to be. So I'll just make it a string, ID, and then down here, we'll actually update our little view bag message to say your ID is equal to plus ID. And so now I can come in here and I can run this. I can come here and type About Us, and I'll make my ID to be my name. So if I run this and I come in here and look at my code, you'll see that ID is set equal to Eric, and then it's going to set it equal to the view bag message. And if I run this, go back to my page, your ID is equal to Eric. Now what happens if I remove my value from there? Notice the resource can't be found because it does not match the route. The route is expecting an ID to be passed. Now if I want, I can make this ID optional. To do that, I come in here and put a question mark, and then I run it. I can type in About Us, hit enter, and you'll notice this time it's coming across as null. So I can still make use of this. The route will still be found even if an ID value is not passed in by placing that question mark. Now the next thing I want to take a look at is I actually want to limit this to be an integer value. So I can come in here and I can specify a route constraint like that. By putting that :int, that's going to limit that ID to some type of integer value. To string. And now we'll run it. Come in here and I will type in About Us /3. Now you'll notice our About action has picked it up, and our ID value is 3. And if we let this run all the way through, your ID is 3. Now what if I were to go back in and type in Eric again? What would happen? Resource cannot be found. Because I'm using a string that doesn't match the defined route constraint, in the route attribute, so it can't find the controller action that it's supposed to execute. Now, what if I want to make it optional? What if I don't want to specify anything at all? Go back to Visual Studio, stop the application, come in here, we'll throw our question mark back in. But now we have to make our int to be nullable. As we know, earlier we used a string, and a string can be equal to null, but an int type cannot. So we have to make it an int nullable. So now I'm going to save, and now I will run it in Internet Explorer. And do about us. And now if I don't specify a value, we're going to see that our int, our ID value, is in fact null. So that's an example of how to use constraints. The next thing that we want to take a look at is a new attribute called route prefix. If we come up here, we can specify a route prefix on our controller. And this is going to actually have a similar effect to actually typing in your controller/action in your URL. So in this case, we're going to call it home. So now when I go to call this, in fact, we'll actually switch this back to just a regular ID with a string to keep it simple. Now when I run this, if I type in about us, it can't find it anymore. Even if I type in about us with Eric, it can't find it. But I have to come in here and put in my route prefix, and now it finds my about controller action. Go back to my web page, and there we see it. Now, one additional thing that I can do is I can actually apply the route attribute itself to my controller, and I can actually specify a default action name. So in this case, we'll make it about us. So now when my page loads, it will actually, instead of defaulting to the index, it will now actually default to the about controller action. So if I run this, I'm actually missing my closing bracket on that. So let's go back to our code. There we go. I'm missing my closing bracket. So we'll save that and we'll try again. So let's type in home now and see what happens. Oh, we didn't get a page. The resource cannot be found. Let's go back to our code and figure out why that is. If we come back here, we'll actually notice that we've done action equal about us. But the actual about action is actually being overridden by this route. In order for this to work properly, we should actually pick a different controller action that's not using a route attribute, like contact. So if we come up here and change this to contact, of course after we stop the application from running, change that to contact, and then we run it, and then we type in home, as we can see, the default page that gets loaded up for home is the contact page, as we would expect. Now let's go ahead and remove this default action, and let's take a look at overriding this route prefix. Let's say, for example, we really didn't want to have to type in home/about us in order to view the About Us page. We still just wanted to type in About Us. We could actually come in here and do this, and now we can actually bring up the About Us page quite easily by simply typing in About Us and not having to click on, not to have to type in home. So if I run this, Need my semicolon. So now if I type in home about us, nothing loads. Even though we have our route prefix set to home, because we have the squiggly in front of a /, it's actually going to cause us to have to type in this. Whoop. And now we're back into the about controller action. And if we go back to the web page, we'll notice that our About Us is now loaded. The final thing that we want to take a look at in terms of attribute routing is the use of areas. So we can actually come up here to the top of our home controller, and we can type in route area, and we can actually specify an area for this route. So in this case, I'm going to just create an area just called sample. And now I can come in here and I can run this. There's one slight change I want to make to the code before we run this particular example. If you remember down here, we actually overrode the route prefix, and we don't want to do that for our route area test. So we're just going to delete that right there, and we're going to run it again. So now, if I want to use my route area, I type in sample/home/about-us, and now I will go down into my about controller action. It picked it up and it displays the page. If I were to just type in home, I'll get an error because I'm using the route area. One last thing we'll take a quick look at has to do with creating URLs in our views that map to these particular routes. I can come in here and I can actually assign this a name. So we're going to give this a name of About Us. And then we're going to come over to our view. We'll come to our actual homepage view. And in this view, we're going to add a link. So what we'll do is actually delete all of this content. And we're just going to add a simple link here. This is going to go to the About Us page. We're going to do route URL, and then we're going to give it the name of our route URL, which is About Us. And we'll save that, and we'll run this. And now you see I have my little About Us link up here. Now, notice if we were to view the source of this page, here's our About Us link. Notice it has sample, home, About Us. By using the URL.routeURL method, it actually goes and finds our route and then calculates it based upon our route attribute tags. It calculates it based upon our attribute routing. And then in this case, we're actually creating a link. So if we go back to our thing, back to our page, and click About Us, our About page loads up as expected.